the final years of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler's grip on Western Europe seemed immovable. From the beaches of northern France to the ports of Norway, his forces waited for what they knew was coming, an Allied invasion. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that the greatest military deception in modern history was already underway. By the middle of the 1940s, Adolf Hitler's empire stretched across nearly all of continental Western Europe. From the Pyrenees in the south to the Arctic Circle in the north, Nazi control was firm. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway had all fallen in the early blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940 and 1941. Only Britain had managed to hold out, narrowly avoiding invasion through a combination of air superiority, sea power, and sheer resilience. But for the Allies, primarily Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, the real challenge was clear. At some point, they would need to launch a massive invasion across the English Channel to liberate Western Europe from Nazi occupation. That single fact drove much of the strategic planning in the final years of the Second World War. The Soviet Union was pushing the Germans hard on the Eastern Front, suffering enormous losses in the process. Stalin, increasingly impatient, had been demanding a second front in the West for years. Roosevelt and Churchill knew that delaying too long could damage the fragile Allied partnership. But there was one massive problem. How do you invade a continent that has spent years preparing for you? Hitler understood the importance of the coming Allied invasion better than anyone. Beginning in 1942, he ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, or Atlantic Wall, a vast network of defensive fortifications stretching over 2,000 miles from the coast of Norway to the French-Spanish border. It included thousands of concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and machine gun nests. These defenses were built to repel any landing attempt, and they were concentrated around key ports and beaches where an invasion seemed most likely. The task of overseeing these defenses eventually fell to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, a German commander with a formidable reputation from the North African campaign. Rommel had seen firsthand how effective Allied air power and mobility could be. He believed that the key to repelling an invasion was to stop it at the water's edge, before it could gain a foothold. To do that, he accelerated the strengthening of beach defenses. Steel tetrahedrons, wooden stakes rigged with explosives, and thick concrete pillboxes were installed by the thousands. Entire coastlines were transformed into lethal traps. But even as the Atlantic Wall took shape, there were weaknesses. Hitler's generals disagreed on where the invasion would come. Some believed Normandy was a strong possibility due to its accessibility and geography. Others were convinced the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between England and France, was the obvious target. The Allies understood these debates and planned to exploit them. But that opportunity would only matter if they could first get their troops across the Channel safely. Planning such a massive operation was unprecedented. It would require the coordination of hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of ships, and vast quantities of equipment and supplies. The Allies had to find not just a place to land, but a way to keep their forces alive in the face of heavily fortified German defenses. It was not just a question of when to strike, but how to make the enemy look the other way while it happened. This problem of invasion wasn't just military, it was psychological. By the end of 1943, the Germans were on the defensive, but they were still deeply entrenched. The Wehrmacht remained a powerful force, and the Luftwaffe, though weakened, could still pose a threat. German commanders knew an invasion was coming, but they did not know where or when. That uncertainty was the Allies' best advantage, and they knew it. By this point in the war, the Allies had already been practicing deception in smaller theaters. They had used misleading signals and feints in North Africa to confuse Rommel during the battles of El Alamein. They had executed a clever ruse before the invasion of Sicily, famously using a dead body with fake documents, an operation known as mincemeat, to misdirect German forces. These operations had shown that even small, well-planned lies could save lives and shift strategic outcomes. But what the Allies needed now was something on a completely different scale. They needed to deceive not just a local commander or a regional force, but the entire German high command and Hitler himself. The stakes were immense. If the Germans guessed the right invasion point and concentrated their forces there, the result could be catastrophic. Thousands of Allied soldiers could die on the beaches before even firing a shot. A failed landing would not only be a military disaster, but a political one, possibly extending the war for years. Victory required more than just bravery and strength. It required convincing Hitler to look in the wrong direction at the exact right moment. By the early years of the Second World War, the Allies had realized they could not win by force alone. German firepower, discipline, and strategic positioning made direct assaults costly and dangerous. To gain the upper hand, Allied planners began experimenting with something far more subtle: deception. And nowhere did this begin more effectively than in the dry, windswept deserts of North Africa. The North African Campaign, which stretched from 1940 to 1943, was a vast, mobile war fought across thousands of miles of open terrain. In this environment, visibility was high, and troop movements were easier to detect. That made it the perfect testing ground for military deception. If you could make the enemy believe your tanks were somewhere they were not, or believe you had more men than you actually did, you could shape the battle before the first shot was fired. One of the early pioneers of deception in the desert was British officer Colonel Dudley Clark. Based in Cairo, Clark headed a secret unit known as A-Force. His team was tasked with developing and executing deceptive operations to mislead Axis forces. Rather than rely on brute strength, Clark used imagination. He helped orchestrate dummy tank movements, constructed fake camps, and crafted entirely fictional military units to confuse the Germans. Clark's philosophy was simple but effective. Make the enemy think what you want them to think, and they will act accordingly. One of the tools he employed was visual trickery. British forces built fake tanks out of wood and canvas, designed to resemble real armored vehicles from a distance or in aerial photographs. They also disguised real tanks to look like harmless supply trucks, camouflaging strength as weakness. This technique allowed commanders to mask their intentions, surprise the enemy, and win with fewer casualties. A key moment came in late 1942, during the Second Battle of El Alamein. In preparation for the attack, Clark and his team worked closely with General Bernard Montgomery's forces. To convince Field Marshal Erwin Rommel that the attack would come from the south, the British created a massive fake build-up in that region. They installed dummy vehicles, laid misleading tracks, and even positioned water tanks to support the illusion of large numbers of troops. Meanwhile, the real offensive was being prepared in the north. When the attack began, Rommel was caught off guard. He had expected a different axis of advance. The deception had worked. Though the battle was hard fought, the Allied victory at El Alamein marked a turning point in the North African campaign and demonstrated the power of misleading the enemy before battle ever began. This success encouraged Allied High Command to invest more in deception strategies. Intelligence agencies in both Britain and the United States began dedicating more resources to what was now becoming known as strategic deception. British intelligence, especially MI5 and MI6, began formalizing networks of double agents and codebreakers. The Americans created their own deception unit under the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA. Perhaps the most famous of all deception operations came not in the desert, but just before the Allied invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943. This operation, codenamed Mincemeat, combined creativity, espionage, and psychological manipulation in a way that captured the imagination of planners and historians alike. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. British intelligence would plant fake invasion documents on a dead body, dress the body as a Royal Marine officer, and allow it to wash up on the shores of Spain. The idea was that the Germans would find the documents and believe they had stumbled upon a real Allied invasion plan. To pull it off, British operatives obtained the body of a deceased man and gave him a full identity, complete with personal letters, receipts, and even a photograph of a fictional fiancé. His briefcase contained fake top-secret documents suggesting that the Allies planned to invade Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The body was placed in the water off the coast of Huelva, a region known for its German-friendly Spanish contacts. As hoped, Spanish officials passed the documents to German intelligence. Hitler, convinced by the contents, diverted German troops and equipment to Greece. When the actual invasion of Sicily began in July of 1943, the resistance was lighter than expected. The deception had worked. It cost the Allies almost nothing but saved countless lives. These experiences taught the Allies several valuable lessons. First, they learned that German intelligence could be manipulated. The Abwehr, the Nazi military intelligence agency, had gaps in its vetting procedures. Second, they learned that Hitler was susceptible to false information, especially if it reinforced his existing beliefs. And third, they learned that well-planned deception operations required coordination across military, intelligence, and diplomatic channels. Following the success of Mincemeat, Allied command began to institutionalize deception. In London, a special body known as the London Controlling Section was created under Colonel John Bevan. Its purpose was to oversee deception strategy for the European theater. This unit worked closely with military planners to ensure that every real operation had a corresponding false narrative designed to mislead the enemy. At the same time, British intelligence was running an extraordinary network of double agents. These were German spies who had been captured, turned, and then used to feed misinformation back to the Nazis. The most effective of these was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish national who went by the codename Garbo. Working with MI5, Garbo fabricated an entire network of fictional sub-agents, sending detailed but false reports to Berlin. The Germans believed him completely and paid him handsomely for his work. They even awarded him the Iron Cross, never realizing that he was serving the Allies the entire time. By the end of 1943, the Allies had all the components in place: deception experts, experienced double agents, effective visual tricks, and a proven track record. But the stakes were about to become much higher. The next major operation would not be in North Africa or the Mediterranean. It would take place across the English Channel, where the Allies planned to land on the shores of Nazi-occupied France. It would be the largest amphibious invasion in military history. And if it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. In the final months of 1943, as Allied planners prepared for the long-awaited invasion of Western Europe, a second operation was unfolding quietly in parallel. Its goal was not to land troops, but to mislead, not to fire weapons, but to shape German thinking. This was Operation Bodyguard, the most ambitious deception plan of the Second World War, and perhaps in all of military history. By this point, the Allies had already developed a deep understanding of how and why deception could work. Their successes in North Africa and Sicily had proven that misinformation, when carefully constructed and skillfully delivered, could misdirect enemy resources and reduce casualties. But what lay ahead required something far greater in scope and complexity. This would not be a single operation with a single target. Instead, it would be a collection of coordinated deceptions designed to obscure the real invasion point and to paralyze the German response. Operation Bodyguard was conceived in late 1943 and formally approved in early 1944. It was the brainchild of the London Controlling Section, led by Colonel John Bevan. Working closely with Allied High Command, Bevan's team designed a multi-layered strategy to keep German forces off balance in the critical weeks and months leading up to D-Day. The central goal was simple: protect the location and timing of the real Allied invasion. What would become Operation Overlord, by convincing the Germans that other regions were the true targets. This would force Hitler and his generals to disperse their forces, reduce their ability to respond quickly, and delay their reinforcements to Normandy once the actual landings began. Operation Bodyguard was divided into several sub-operations. each aimed at a different geographical area. One of these was Operation Zeppelin, which suggested that the Allies might attack the Balkans. Another, Operation Sky, hinted at an invasion of Norway. There was even an effort to imply a southern landing in occupied France. But the most important element by far, the one that would most directly affect the course of the war, was Operation Fortitude. Fortitude itself was divided into two parts. Fortitude North was designed to convince the Germans that the Allies were planning an invasion of Norway from Scotland. Its purpose was to tie down German divisions in Scandinavia. Fortitude South, on the other hand, was focused on France, and more specifically, on Pas de Calais. Pas de Calais was the closest point between Britain and France, separated by only about 20 miles of water. It had excellent roads, flat terrain, and direct access to the heart of Germany's defensive network. For those reasons, Hitler and many in the German High Command had long believed it would be the logical location for an Allied invasion. The Allies recognized this belief and decided to use it against them. Under Fortitude South, the Allies would create a massive fictional army group in southeastern England. This fake force, the first US Army Group, or FUSAG, would appear to be preparing to cross the English Channel directly toward Pas de Calais. It would be complete with imaginary divisions, command structures, radio traffic, and supply depots. It would even have a commander, General George S. Patton. Patton was a key piece of the deception. After his temporary removal from combat command following a public scandal, he was seen by both Allied and Axis leaders as a bold, aggressive general. If anyone were to lead the main invasion, the Germans believed, it would be him. By placing Patton in charge of the fictitious FUSAG, the Allies added credibility to the illusion. To make the deception convincing, the Allies used every tool available. They set up fake airfields filled with dummy aircraft made of canvas and wood. Inflatable tanks were positioned in fields where German reconnaissance planes might fly overhead. Dummy landing craft were placed in harbors. Soldiers were assigned to construct false camps, complete with laundry lines, mess halls, and latrines, all visible from the air. But physical deception was only part of the picture. Equally important was the management of information. The Allies created an entire network of fake radio transmissions to simulate the day-to-day communications of a large army preparing for invasion. These signals were carefully scripted to mimic real orders, training updates, and logistical planning. Meanwhile, double agents working for British intelligence fed a steady stream of misleading reports to the German Abwehr. These agents had already built years of credibility, and their messages were trusted in Berlin. Agents like Garbo, Brutus, and Tricycle passed along information that reinforced the illusion of a build-up in southeastern England. Their reports were detailed, sometimes even including troop counts, vehicle movements, and shipping manifests. All of it was false. To further complicate German analysis, the Allies made deliberate efforts to leak small pieces of information in ways that appeared accidental. They allowed certain messages to be intercepted, permitted documents to be lost, and encouraged the spread of rumors through diplomatic and civilian channels. These pieces were then stitched together by German analysts to form a picture that the Allies had carefully constructed. One of the most remarkable aspects of Fortitude was how well it aligned with German expectations. The entire operation played into what intelligence officers call confirmation bias. Hitler already believed that Pas de Calais was the likely invasion point. The evidence presented by Fortitude South seemed to confirm that belief, making it even harder for him to consider alternative possibilities. The impact of this psychological manipulation was profound. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, German commanders concentrated a significant portion of their forces in and around Pas de Calais. These included armored divisions, infantry units, and key artillery assets. These were some of the best trained and best equipped troops in Hitler's Western forces. And when the real invasion came, at Normandy, they would be hundreds of miles away. Even after D-Day, the deception did not immediately end. Fortitude continued to operate in the days and weeks following the landings. Through a combination of radio traffic and agent reports, The Allies maintained the illusion that the Normandy invasion was merely a diversion. They suggested that the real attack, led by Patton's Phantom Army, was still to come at Calais. Hitler believed this long enough to delay reinforcements to Normandy. For nearly 7 weeks, large German formations remained in the north, waiting for an invasion that never came. The success of Operation Bodyguard, and Fortitude in particular, was not the result of a single trick or illusion. It was the product of years of experience, careful planning, and a deep understanding of how enemy intelligence worked. It relied on collaboration across nations, agencies, and branches of the military. And it depended, above all, on credibility. The ability to make a lie look just real enough to be believed. The strength of a lie often lies in its details. For Operation Fortitude South to succeed, it was not enough to simply say there was an army poised to strike at Pas de Calais. The Allies had to make that army look real in every conceivable way. From the air, from the ground, and through every channel of intelligence that the Germans trusted. What unfolded in the countryside of southeastern England during the spring of 1944 was one of the most intricate physical deceptions in military history. The fictional army group at the heart of this illusion was the 1st United States Army Group, known by its acronym FUSAG. It was supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton and included several divisions of infantry, armor, and airborne troops. On paper, it looked formidable, but on the ground, it was a ghost. There were no real divisions stationed there. No actual tanks, no landing ships, and only a small number of real personnel. Everything that gave FUSAG life, its vehicles, buildings, movements, and signals, had to be manufactured from scratch. To achieve this, the Allies turned to specialists in camouflage, engineering, and stagecraft. Units from the Royal Engineers in Britain and similar American teams were brought in to construct a fake military presence in Kent and Sussex, just across the channel from Pas de Calais. Their work involved not only physical props, but also the manipulation of sound, smell, and even behavior. The most iconic element of this deception was the use of inflatable tanks. These rubber models were built to match the dimensions and general appearance of real Sherman or Crusader tanks. From a short distance or from the air, they looked entirely convincing, especially when arranged in clusters surrounded by other props like fake fuel drums or wooden crates. Some even had heating elements or muffled sound machines placed nearby to mimic the heat signatures and engine noise that might be picked up by infrared sensors or ground-based listeners. Alongside the tanks, fake aircraft were deployed on temporary airfields. These were also made of wood and canvas, carefully painted to resemble Spitfires, Thunderbolts, or C-47 transport planes. From a reconnaissance plane flying overhead, the visual difference between these dummies and the real thing was negligible, especially when supported by the right radio traffic and ground activity. Beyond the hardware, the Allies built fake barracks, mess tents, field hospitals, and supply depots. They laid down tire tracks on roads, dug trenches, and even planted rows of laundry to suggest a human presence. Soldiers assigned to these deception units had to maintain the illusion around the clock. They performed visible drills, marched in formation, and kept the camps active at all hours. Their job was to be seen, not to fight, but to act. One of the most creative contributors to this theatrical illusion was the British magician Jasper Maskelyne. Though his role has often been debated or exaggerated in post-war accounts, Maskelyne did work with camouflage units and promoted the use of stagecraft techniques in military deception. His team experimented with ways to hide or simulate objects using light, shadow, and forced perspective, borrowed straight from the world of magic and cinema. But physical deception alone was not enough. To sustain the illusion, the Allies needed to support their ghost army with realistic communication. Radio operators from the Royal Corps of Signals and the United States Signal Corps created an elaborate pattern of fake messages. These were not just random transmissions. They followed authentic schedules and procedures, simulating the chatter of an entire army group. Orders were issued, reports were filed, and logistical requests were sent, all of it false. These signals were intercepted by German listening posts, decrypted and fed into Nazi intelligence systems. To German analysts, it appeared that a large force was assembling in southeastern England. The consistency between what they heard on the radio and what they saw from the air only reinforced the deception. It created a full-spectrum illusion, an army that appeared real across every observable front. Double agents also played a critical role during this phase. Agents such as Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, and Roman Cherniawski, codenamed Brutus, continued feeding Berlin detailed reports of troop movements, training schedules, and impending operations. These agents had built their reputations over years of carefully managed lies. The Germans trusted them implicitly. When they reported that Patton's army was preparing to cross the Channel from Dover to Calais, it confirmed everything the German High Command already believed. To maintain the ruse, the Allies made sure that these agents' reports matched what the Germans were seeing and hearing. Every dummy tank, every campfire, every scripted radio call was designed to echo the information provided by the double agents. This synergy was critical. It did not just mislead the Germans, it made them feel confident in their conclusions. Meanwhile, the real invasion force was gathering quietly in southwestern England. Troops assigned to the Normandy landings were kept under strict orders to minimize exposure. Their activities were deliberately understated. There were no dummy tanks or staged maneuvers. The fewer signs of activity, the better. In some areas, the Allies even took down visible infrastructure to prevent giving away the real build-up. In contrast, the southeastern region was buzzing with staged military activity. Trucks, sometimes just regular delivery vehicles with painted insignia, drove in circles to suggest the movement of supplies. Small groups of soldiers rotated between fake installations to give the impression of multiple units. Local residents, though not fully informed, often noticed the spectacle and assumed it was all part of the real invasion preparation. Even to the British public, the illusion was convincing. What made Operation Fortitude South so successful was its balance of simplicity and detail. The concept, creating a fake army, was straightforward, but the execution demanded coordination across dozens of units, agencies, and disciplines. Engineers, artists, signal operators, intelligence officers, and ordinary soldiers all played a role. Each part of the operation reinforced the others, creating a deception so complete that it became indistinguishable from reality. The Germans, for their part, continued to believe what they saw. Aerial reconnaissance missions captured photographs of the fake buildup. Intercepted messages confirmed the location and command structure of the supposed 1st United States Army Group. Reports from trusted agents supported the idea that Patton, still seen by many as the Allies' most aggressive commander, was preparing to lead the charge. For all the brilliance behind Operation Fortitude South, its success ultimately depended on a very specific and crucial weakness inside the German war machine: Adolf Hitler's inability or unwillingness to rethink his assumptions. From the beginning, Hitler had believed that the Allies would make their main invasion at Pas de Calais. That belief became more than just a theory. It became a blind spot, and the Allies exploited it with surgical precision. To understand why Hitler and his generals placed so much emphasis on Pas de Calais, we need to look at how the German High Command analyzed the strategic situation. Pas de Calais was the shortest route across the English Channel. It offered the most direct access to Belgium and the heart of Germany's industrial regions. The terrain there was flat, ideal for armored divisions. It also had deep-water ports and well-developed infrastructure that would support rapid reinforcement and supply. These practical reasons gave weight to the theory, but what turned it into a certainty in Hitler's mind was something more psychological. Hitler had a deep conviction that the Allies, like him, would prefer the most efficient and direct route. He saw the world through a lens of calculation and speed. He believed that strategic logic would lead to strategic predictability. This made him dangerously inflexible when that logic was deliberately manipulated. As the months passed in early 1944, German intelligence services began receiving a steady stream of reports pointing to a massive Allied force building in southeastern England. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed the presence of landing craft, tanks, and what looked like divisional headquarters. Radio intercepts picked up regular signals from what was believed to be the 1st United States Army Group. Double agents, particularly those managed by British intelligence, sent highly detailed updates on the movements, commanders, and targets of the supposed force. Every piece of evidence pointed toward Calais. What the Germans did not realize was that all of it was fabricated. The spies they trusted most had been turned. The radio traffic was scripted. The tanks were rubber. The entire army existed only on paper, in photographs, and in the minds of overconfident analysts. At the head of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. By this point in the war, Canaris had grown increasingly disillusioned with the Nazi regime. Though his department was still active, it was compromised from within and under increasing scrutiny by the SS and the Gestapo. The overall coordination of German intelligence had suffered. Rivalry between the Abwehr, the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, and other branches created confusion and a lack of centralized control. In this fractured system, the idea of a Calais invasion went largely unchallenged. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander of German forces in Western Europe, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in charge of coastal defenses, held different views about how to respond to an invasion. Rommel believed that any Allied landing had to be defeated immediately, at the water's edge. He pushed for forward deployed forces and immediate counterattacks. Rundstedt, on the other hand, favored a strategic reserve that could be deployed once the actual landing site was confirmed. But both men agreed on one thing: if the Allies landed, they would do it at Calais. This consensus within the German command structure was exactly what the Allies had hoped for. It meant that even when the Normandy landings occurred, many German officers would still believe it was a feint. They would hesitate. They would wait for the real invasion. Hitler, isolated in his headquarters and increasingly distrustful of his own generals, was particularly rigid. On June the 6th, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Hitler initially refused to release armored divisions held in reserve near Calais. He believed that Normandy was a distraction, a trick to draw German forces away from the true landing point. Even as German troops in Normandy came under heavy pressure, he insisted that the main attack was still to come. This delay was catastrophic. By the time the German High Command realized that Normandy was not a diversion, the Allies had secured beachheads, landed reinforcements, and pushed inland. The moment for a decisive counterattack had passed. In Berlin, Hitler's senior staff struggled to interpret what was happening. The situation reports from the front were chaotic. Communications were disrupted by Allied bombing. Intelligence channels were muddied by the very deceptions that had led them astray. Yet, for days, and in some cases weeks, German commanders continued to anticipate a second, larger invasion at Calais. As late as mid-July, Hitler maintained significant forces in the Pas de Calais region, including elite panzer divisions and thousands of troops. These units were desperately needed in Normandy, where the Allies had broken out of the beachheads and were advancing toward Paris. But the specter of a second landing kept them locked in place. This refusal to adjust his thinking reflected a broader problem in Hitler's leadership. By 1944, he had become increasingly isolated from reality. His orders were based not on battlefield conditions, but on ideology, paranoia, and assumptions. He dismissed reports that contradicted his expectations and clung to those that supported them. This cognitive rigidity gave Allied deception efforts enormous power. German intelligence analysts, even when faced with mounting evidence that the Normandy landings were the real invasion, hesitated to challenge the dominant narrative. They feared being wrong. They feared contradicting Hitler, and so the lie held. There were also practical limits on the German ability to respond quickly. Allied air superiority made movement difficult. Roads and railways were under constant attack. Even if commanders wanted to redeploy their forces, doing so under fire was slow and dangerous. The deception had bought the Allies time, and in warfare, time is often the difference between success and failure. In the early morning hours of June the 6th, 1944, while much of Europe still slept under Nazi occupation, the largest amphibious invasion in military history began. It was not aimed at Pas de Calais, where Adolf Hitler and many of his generals believed the attack would come. It struck instead on the beaches of Normandy, farther west, more lightly defended and underestimated. The moment the Allies had planned for years had finally arrived, and everything hinged on whether their deception had worked. The operation was called Overlord, and it involved more than 150,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel in a single day. Supported by thousands of ships and aircraft, they came ashore along a 50-mile stretch of the French coastline. The beaches were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each assigned to different Allied forces from the United States, Britain, and Canada. In the hours before the landings, Allied paratroopers from the US 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with British and Canadian airborne units, were dropped behind enemy lines to disrupt communications, capture key bridges, and sow confusion. These troops faced intense challenges: scattered landings, strong German resistance, and difficult terrain. Yet their mission was critical: to delay German reinforcements and create openings for the seaborne invasion forces. Meanwhile, an enormous naval fleet assembled off the coast. More than 5,000 vessels took part in the crossing, including battleships, destroyers, troop transports, landing craft, and support ships. Allied warships opened fire on German coastal defenses, while landing craft ferried waves of soldiers toward the beaches under fire. At Omaha Beach, where American forces landed, German resistance was particularly fierce. Steep cliffs, heavy machine gun fire, and well-positioned bunkers created a deadly kill zone. Casualties were high in the first hours, and for a time, it seemed the beachhead might fail. But through determination, leadership, and sheer persistence, American troops began to push forward, securing their position by the end of the day. On the other beaches, resistance varied. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches met stiff opposition in some areas, but managed to advance inland more quickly. At Utah Beach, another American landing zone, strong currents had accidentally carried the first wave off course, ironically placing them in a less defended area. That mistake saved lives and allowed a rapid breakthrough. Throughout the day, Allied air superiority played a critical role. Bombers targeted German positions, supply routes, and reinforcements. Fighter planes protected the skies over the beaches. The Luftwaffe, weakened and disorganized, failed to mount a significant response. What made this invasion different from so many others in history was not just its scale, but the fact that the defenders were unprepared. The Atlantic Wall, while formidable in places, was incomplete in others. German troops stationed in Normandy were second-tier units, not the elite panzer divisions held in reserve near Pas de Calais. Rommel, the commander responsible for defending the coast, was not even present when the invasion began. He had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, convinced, like many others, that the real attack was still weeks away. The German reaction to the invasion was slow and confused. Local commanders requested reinforcements, but were told to hold until higher approval came. That approval had to come from Hitler himself. And Hitler, deeply convinced that Normandy was a diversion, refused to release the armored divisions stationed near Calais. He waited for what he believed would be the main Allied strike, still expecting General Patton to lead a larger force toward the north. As hours turned into days, this hesitation became a decisive factor. While German commanders debated, the Allies built up their forces. Within 48 hours, more than 300,000 troops had landed. Equipment, vehicles, and supplies poured ashore. Engineers constructed temporary harbors to unload cargo. Field hospitals treated the wounded. Communications lines were established. The beachheads were no longer fragile. They were strong, expanding, and growing harder to dislodge by the hour. Only gradually did the German High Command begin to accept that Normandy was the real invasion. But by then, the cost of their delay was enormous. The panzer divisions finally released from Calais faced constant air attacks on their journey west. Bridges had been destroyed, roads were cratered, Fuel was scarce, and when they arrived, they faced well-entrenched Allied forces backed by naval artillery and overwhelming air support. The success of the Normandy landings was not guaranteed. Every aspect of the operation had involved risks, from the weather to the tides to the complex coordination between nations and branches of the military. But one of the most crucial elements was the deception that preceded it. Because German forces had been misled about the location and timing of the invasion, they failed to mount a unified and timely defense. The result was a narrow window of opportunity, and the Allies seized it. D-Day, as it came to be known, marked the beginning of the end of Nazi control in Western Europe. Within weeks, Allied forces would liberate key cities, link up the separate beachheads, and begin the drive toward Paris. German troops were pushed back, and their strategic position in the West began to collapse. For Hitler, the shock of Normandy was compounded by the realization that he had been tricked. The ghost armies, the dummy tanks, the fake radio signals, and the trusted agents all had been part of a vast illusion, and he had believed it. His refusal to see the truth, even when it was unfolding in front of him, had cost him the ability to respond effectively. Even after the landings, Hitler remained convinced that Normandy might still be a diversion. He continued to withhold some forces near Calais for weeks. The Allies, fully aware of this, maintained the illusion long enough to secure their positions and begin the liberation of France. By June 7, 1944, the Allies had succeeded in establishing a vital foothold in Normandy. The beaches had been secured, supply lines were expanding, and reinforcements were arriving by the hour. Yet, despite the extraordinary scale of the invasion, Adolf Hitler and much of the German High Command remained convinced that the landings were only the first act in a larger Allied strategy. And so, remarkably, the deception did not end on D-Day. It was extended well beyond it, continuing to shape German military decisions for weeks. This sustained misdirection was part of the brilliance of Operation Fortitude. The plan had always included a post-invasion phase. Allied intelligence understood that simply landing in Normandy was not enough. The beachheads were vulnerable, the terrain was difficult, and German counterattacks were expected. What the Allies needed now was time. Time to dig in, to consolidate their positions, and to prepare for the hard push inland. And to buy that time, they continued feeding the myth of a second, larger invasion through Pas de Calais. The deception persisted on every front. The fake 1st United States Army Group, still commanded by General George S. Patton, remained fully operational on paper. Radio traffic continued at regular intervals. Double agents maintained their cover stories, reporting new details about the delayed Calais invasion. From the German perspective, Normandy could very well be a diversion. The bulk of Allied strength, according to the intelligence they believed, was still massed in southeastern England. British intelligence officers managing double agents crafted highly specific updates. Agent Garbo, operating under British control but trusted completely by the Germans, sent more than 20 detailed messages to Berlin in the weeks following the Normandy landings. These reports warned that additional forces, much larger than those already in France, were preparing to cross the Channel at Calais. He claimed that the invasion in Normandy had been a diversion to draw German forces away from the real objective. Other agents provided complementary stories. They referred to troop sightings, unusual transport activity, and coded messages that, when combined, painted a vivid picture of an impending second wave. German analysts, eager to make sense of the complex situation, found these messages persuasive. The information matched what they thought they knew, and it reinforced Hitler's long-standing assumption that Calais was the true target. This belief had strategic consequences. German armored divisions in northern France were kept in reserve. Orders to shift units from Calais to Normandy were delayed or only partially implemented. Commanders hesitated, uncertain whether to fully commit to the fight in the West. The result was a critical weakening of the German response at a time when Allied forces were still vulnerable. Incredibly, the Germans even believed that General Patton himself was still preparing to lead the main invasion. Despite having no real command role in Normandy at that point, Patton's reputation as an aggressive and capable general made him the perfect decoy. Photographs were published in Allied newspapers showing Patton inspecting troops in southeastern England. These public appearances were staged to give credibility to the idea that he was leading FUSAG. German observers, reading both official and unofficial reports, continued to place enormous weight on his movements. Meanwhile, Allied commanders in Normandy were fully aware that this deception was still influencing German strategy. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General Dwight D. Eisenhower received intelligence briefings confirming that large concentrations of German forces remained positioned near Calais. This knowledge gave them the confidence to take greater risks and to push harder into occupied France. As long as the German divisions were not redeployed, the Allies could maneuver with fewer threats to their flanks. One of the key technical tools used during this phase was ongoing fake radio traffic. Even though there were no real soldiers to command, signal units kept transmitting messages as if entire divisions were training, moving, and preparing for battle. These communications were designed to be intercepted. They discussed supplies, weather, troop morale, and requests for air support. The volume and structure of the messages mimicked real military operations. For German intelligence officers listening in, the illusion held. In addition to signals and agents, physical deception was quietly maintained. Inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft were not immediately removed. They remained in place for weeks after D-Day. Patrols and light aircraft observed these props regularly, ensuring that the deception remained visible. From the air, the camps still appeared active, with the illusion of vehicle movement and daily activity. The Allies even staged construction projects and false supply dumps to suggest ongoing preparations. The psychological impact on the German high command was significant. Hitler's belief in a second invasion made him cautious and slow to react. Even as the Allied breakout from Normandy gained momentum in July and August, he continued to suspect that another attack at Calais could come at any moment. This persistent fear limited his ability to concentrate forces and launch coordinated counteroffensives. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and others eventually recognized that Normandy was the main front, but by then the damage had been done. Divisions that could have made a difference in the early weeks of the campaign remained inactive or arrived too late. The opportunity to crush the beachheads had passed. Even after the breakout from Normandy, remnants of the deception lingered. The Allies maintained some of the fiction until the liberation of Paris. Only when it was clear that the German front had collapsed did they begin to scale back the illusion. By that point, the deception had done its job. The Allies had secured a foothold, advanced deep into France, and set the stage for the final push into Germany. The extended success of Operation Fortitude after D-Day demonstrated the power of strategic patience. The Allies had not only built a brilliant lie, they had sustained it long enough for it to shape the outcome of an entire campaign. The coordination between agents, signal officers, military planners, and ordinary soldiers had created a seamless story. Every part of the deception reinforced the others. In the end, the Germans had not just been fooled once. They had been fooled continuously, for months, through a combination of visual trickery, trusted spies, false intelligence, and their own unchallenged assumptions. The consequences of that continued deception were enormous. It delayed the German military response, reduced Allied casualties, and accelerated the collapse of Nazi control in Western Europe. When the dust finally settled in Europe in the spring of 1945, the world began to reflect on the cost and complexity of the Second World War. The fighting had stretched across continents, involved dozens of nations, and claimed tens of millions of lives. But as historians and military analysts began to piece together the factors that shaped the Allied victory, one theme repeatedly stood out: not a great battle or a powerful weapon, but a lie. More precisely, a network of carefully constructed lies that had begun years before the first Allied boots touched the beaches of Normandy. Operation Fortitude, as part of the broader Operation Bodyguard, had not only protected the greatest amphibious invasion in history, it had fundamentally altered the course of the war. The success of this deception campaign proved that in modern conflict, information and belief could be just as decisive as tanks and bullets. In the years following the war, as classified files were gradually released and intelligence operations declassified, the true scale of the Allied deception efforts became clear. What had once been the domain of a small circle of planners and intelligence officers was now studied by military schools, historians, and even diplomats. The idea that entire divisions could be conjured out of thin air and that those illusions could shape enemy strategy was no longer dismissed as a trick. It was recognized as strategy in its highest form. One of the most enduring elements of this legacy was the use of double agents, men and women who, through subtlety and patience, had earned the trust of the German intelligence services while secretly feeding them false information. Agent Garbo, whose real name was Juan Pujol Garcia, became one of the most celebrated figures in this story. A Spanish civilian with no formal military background, Garbo had invented dozens of fictitious sub-agents and sent hundreds of false reports to Berlin, all coordinated with British intelligence. The Germans considered him one of their most reliable sources. They awarded him the Iron Cross. Unbeknownst to them, the British awarded him the Member of the Order of the British Empire. He was, uniquely, decorated by both sides of the war. His work delayed German reinforcements after D-Day and helped convince Hitler that the real invasion was still to come. Without Garbo's credibility, the elaborate deception surrounding Fortitude South might have collapsed. Equally important were the men and women who built and operated the physical aspects of the deception: the dummy tanks, the inflatable aircraft, and the fake camps. These efforts required not only technical skill but extraordinary attention to detail. Props had to appear convincing from the air. Tracks had to match the supposed movement of vehicles. Campfires had to burn at night to simulate troop activity. Every illusion had to stand up to scrutiny because the enemy was constantly watching. And then there were the signal operators, who broadcast hours of fake radio traffic every day. These soldiers worked in near isolation, transmitting orders, reports, and chatter from non-existent units. They followed military procedures precisely, mimicking the tone and rhythm of genuine field communications. In doing so, they wove a digital tapestry that matched the physical illusion on the ground. Historians have since noted that what made Operation Fortitude so effective was not any single element in isolation, but the combination of all of them. The lies reinforced each other. The visual evidence supported the radio traffic. The agent reports confirmed what German reconnaissance observed, and the Germans, already predisposed to believe in a Calais invasion, were caught in a web of their own assumptions. The consequences of this deception went far beyond June the 6th. By keeping German forces stationed in Pas de Calais for weeks after the Normandy landings, the Allies were able to pour men and materiel into France with minimal interference. This helped create the conditions for Operation Cobra, the breakout from the beachhead, and eventually the liberation of Paris. The entire Western campaign was shaped by the time and space that Fortitude had bought. But the legacy of Fortitude and Operation Bodyguard also had broader implications. In the post-war years, military strategists began to understand deception not as a supporting tactic, but as a core component of planning. The lessons learned during the Second World War were studied and adopted by later generations, from Cold War intelligence operations to modern-day psychological warfare. In fact, some elements of Fortitude have become textbook examples in military academies around the world. They demonstrate how an adversary's expectations can be weaponized, how ambiguity can be a form of strength, and how truth and falsehood can coexist in the fog of war. This legacy also helped reshape the way historians view warfare. The focus on battles, generals, and weapons remained important, but there was a growing recognition of the hidden dimensions of conflict. Intelligence, code-breaking, and deception were no longer side stories. They were central chapters. In the case of D-Day, they may well have been decisive. There is also a human dimension to this legacy. The individuals who played roles in the deception, often unsung during their lifetimes, acted with quiet bravery. Many of them were never on the front lines. Some never fired a weapon. Yet their work saved lives by reducing resistance, shortening battles, and confusing the enemy. Their battlefield was one of ideas, appearances, and persuasion. For the Germans, the exposure of these deceptions after the war was sobering. Interrogations with captured officers and intelligence officials revealed genuine surprise. Many admitted they had believed the reports from their agents. They had trusted the reconnaissance photographs. They had not suspected that the Allied effort to mislead them could be so coordinated and comprehensive. Some analysts later argued that German intelligence had become too rigid, too reliant on existing assumptions, and too divided by internal rivalries. Others suggested that Hitler's domineering leadership made it difficult for dissenting voices to challenge false beliefs. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same: a misreading of Allied intentions that contributed directly to the failure to stop the invasion. In the decades that followed, books, documentaries, and scholarly papers examined every detail of Operation Fortitude. The idea that Hitler had been outmaneuvered not by force, but by fiction, became a compelling narrative. It offered a different kind of war story, one where ingenuity, misdirection, and careful planning defeated brute strength. Today, the story of fortitude continues to inspire interest and admiration. Museums in Normandy and England display examples of the dummy tanks and aircraft used in the deception. Military training courses include sections on strategic deception, often citing fortitude as the gold standard. And the name of Garbo has become a symbol of the power of intelligence to shape history. But perhaps the most profound legacy is a simple one. It reminds us that in war, as in life, people often believe what they expect to be true. And when expectations are manipulated skillfully enough, even the most powerful leaders can be led astray. Hitler was not defeated by inflatable tanks alone. He was defeated by the Allied commitment to strategy, unity, and imagination. Fortitude succeeded because it exploited not just German weakness, but Allied strength, the ability to coordinate across nations, disciplines, and agencies in pursuit of a common goal. In the end, the fake armies never fired a shot, but they helped win a war.